Sarah Thompson lived a quiet, uneventful life in her suburban neighborhood. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names, lawns were perfectly manicured, and rules were followed to the letter. The Homeowners Association, HOA, took pride in maintaining order and ensuring that every house, and even every car, met their strict aesthetic guidelines. For years, Sarah had no issues with the HOA. She kept her property tidy, paid her dues on time, and did her best to stay out of trouble. But one sunny afternoon, everything changed when an envelope arrived in her mailbox. The letter inside wasn't from a friend or family member. It was official looking, printed on crisp white paper with the HOA's logo at the top. Sarah opened it cautiously, expecting another reminder about lawn maintenance or perhaps an invitation to the annual block party. Instead, what she read made her heart skip a beat. According to the letter, she had violated Section 4.2 of the HOA's guidelines. No vehicles displaying unauthorized decals, wraps, or modifications shall be parked within view of common areas. For this infraction, she owed a hefty fine of $500. Sarah blinked in disbelief. A car wrap? Unauthorized decals? None of it made sense. Her car was a modest sedan, nothing flashy, nothing customized. She always ensured it looked clean and presentable because she didn't want to attract unnecessary attention from the ever-watchful HOA. So how could they accuse her of something like this? Determined to get to the bottom of things, Sarah grabbed her keys and headed outside. As she approached her driveway, her jaw dropped. There, sitting exactly where she'd left her car that morning, was a vehicle, but it wasn't hers. Well, not entirely. The shape and size resembled her sedan, but instead of its usual silver paint job, the car was now covered in a sleek black wrap. Subtle decals adorned the sides, blending almost seamlessly into the design unless you looked closely. Words like Department of Justice and Official Use Only were faintly visible under the sunlight. Sarah stared at the car, feeling a mix of confusion and panic. Had someone tampered with her vehicle? Was this some sort of prank by her neighbors? Or worse, had her car been stolen and replaced with this mysterious imposter? She circled the vehicle, inspecting it for clues. The license plate matched hers, which only deepened the mystery. Everything else, however, was completely different. Even the key fob in her hand refused to unlock the doors, confirming her growing suspicion. This was not her car. Her mind raced with questions. Who would do such a thing? And why? More importantly, how was she going to explain this bizarre situation to the HOA? They weren't known for their leniency, and a $500 fine felt like just the beginning of her problems. As Sarah stood there, staring at the unfamiliar yet oddly official-looking vehicle, she couldn't shake the feeling that her quiet, predictable life was about to take a very strange turn. Little did she know, the truth behind the car was far more complicated and extraordinary than anything she could have imagined. Agent Harris's sudden appearance on her driveway felt like something out of a movie. Sarah couldn't help but stare at him, her mind racing to catch up with the whirlwind of events unfolding before her. Here she was, standing next to a mysterious black sedan that wasn't hers, listening to a man in a crisp suit explain that it belonged to the FBI. It sounded absurd, yet there he was, calm, professional, and completely unfazed by the chaos his agency had inadvertently caused. "I know this must be confusing," Agent Harris said, his tone measured and reassuring. He adjusted his tie slightly as he continued. "The vehicle is part of an ongoing surveillance operation. Due to an internal oversight, it was mistakenly assigned to your address as a temporary holding location." Sarah blinked, trying to process his words. Surveillance, holding location. None of it made sense in the context of her quiet suburban life. She lived among families who baked cookies for block parties and argued over hedge heights, not spies or secret operations. "Wait," Sarah finally managed to say, finding her voice. "You're telling me the FBI parked one of their cars in my driveway by accident?" Her tone was equal parts disbelief and frustration. She gestured toward the sedan, still wrapped in its sleek, official-looking decals. And now my HOA thinks I did this. They fined me $500 because of your mistake. Agent Harris nodded solemnly, clearly aware of how problematic the situation was. I understand how frustrating this must be, he said. Unfortunately, these things happen when multiple departments are involved. We'll do everything we can to rectify the issue. Despite his calm demeanor, Sarah wasn't ready to let him off the hook just yet. How does something like this even happen? She pressed, crossing her arms. Don't you guys have systems in place to prevent mix-ups like this? Agent Harris hesitated for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Typically, yes, he admitted. But in this case, someone entered the wrong coordinates during a routine logistics update. Your address was flagged as a safe point for undercover vehicles, which led to the car being delivered here instead of its intended destination. Sarah raised an eyebrow. A safe point? For what? Are you saying my house is some kind of secret FBI drop-off spot now? The idea was almost laughable, if it weren't so infuriating. She had never signed up for any of this. All she wanted was to live peacefully in her neighborhood without drama or complications. Before Agent Harris could respond, the distant sound of sirens interrupted their conversation. Moments later, a police cruiser pulled up to the curb, its lights flashing but its sirens silent. Two officers stepped out, eyeing the scene cautiously. One of them approached Sarah, while the other lingered near the sedan, inspecting it with obvious curiosity. Ma'am, we received a call about a suspicious vehicle, the first officer said, glancing between Sarah and Agent Harris. Is everything okay here? Sarah opened her mouth to explain, but Agent Harris stepped forward before she could speak. Officers, I'm Agent Harris with the FBI, he began, producing his badge once again. This vehicle belongs to our agency. It was mistakenly delivered to Miss Thompson's residence due to an administrative error. There's no cause for concern. The officers exchanged skeptical looks. While they seemed to accept Agent Harris's explanation, they weren't entirely convinced. After all, a black sedan with government decals sitting in a residential driveway was bound to raise eyebrows, even in a neighborhood as ordinary as this one. Once the officers were satisfied that nothing nefarious was happening, they left, leaving Sarah alone with Agent Harris. As the cruiser drove away, Sarah turned back to the agent, her frustration bubbling to the surface. So what happens now? She asked, her voice tinged with exasperation. How do I fix this mess with the HOA? They think I deliberately violated their rules. Agent Harris offered her a small apologetic smile. Leave that to us, he assured her. We'll provide documentation proving that the car is ours and that you had nothing to do with it. In the meantime, we'll relocate the vehicle immediately to avoid further confusion. Though his words provided some relief, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the ordeal was far from over. Dealing with the HOA wouldn't be easy. They weren't exactly known for their flexibility. Still, she took solace in knowing that the truth was finally coming to light. If nothing else, this bizarre incident would make for quite the story, at least once it was all resolved. As Sarah stood frozen in front of the mysterious black sedan, her mind buzzed with questions. She had always been a rule follower, someone who double-checked every detail to avoid conflict. Yet here she was, staring at a car that wasn't hers, but somehow bore her license plate. A car wrapped in decals that hinted at something far beyond her understanding. The situation felt surreal, like stepping into the plot of a movie or a conspiracy thriller. Her first instinct was to call the police. After all, if this wasn't her car, then where was hers? And how had someone managed to swap it without her noticing? With trembling fingers, she dialed the non-emergency line and explained what she'd found. The operator promised to send an officer over as soon as possible, though they sounded skeptical about her story. Are you sure it's not just a prank? They asked gently, as if trying not to offend her. Sarah insisted it wasn't. That much was clear from the precision of the wrap and the official-looking insignias. Still, doubt lingered in her voice, even as she hung up the phone. While waiting for the police, Sarah decided to take a closer look at the vehicle. She crouched down beside it, examining every inch of its exterior. The decals were subtle but unmistakable, small emblems resembling government seals, along with phrases like, "For official use only," and U.S. Department of Justice. There were no flashy logos or loud designs. It was designed to blend in, almost invisible, unless you paid close attention. Whoever had done this clearly knew what they were doing. But why would anyone go through such trouble? Was this some elaborate joke by one of her neighbors? Sarah glanced around the street, half expecting to see someone hiding behind a bush, laughing at her confusion. But the neighborhood was eerily quiet, the only sounds coming from birds chirping and distant lawnmowers humming in the background. No pranks, no hidden cameras, just silence. Then something caught her eye. Through the tinted windows of the sedan, she spotted a faint glimmer inside the car. It looked like wires, or maybe equipment of some sort. Her stomach tightened. Could this car belong to spies? Government agents? That thought seemed ridiculous, yet the evidence before her suggested otherwise. The more she studied the sedan, the less it resembled an ordinary civilian vehicle. Its polished finish, discreet branding, and high-tech appearance hinted at something far more serious than a simple misunderstanding. Just as Sarah was starting to spiral into wild theories, a man in a dark suit appeared at the edge of her driveway. He walked with purpose, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. For a moment, Sarah froze, unsure whether to feel relieved or alarmed. The man stopped a few feet away and introduced himself as Agent Harris, flashing a badge that gleamed in the sunlight. His calm demeanor instantly set him apart from the chaos swirling in Sarah's mind. "I understand you've discovered our vehicle," he said matter-of-factly, gesturing toward the sedan. Sarah blinked, struggling to process his words. "Your vehicle," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Agent Harris nodded, explaining that the car was part of an ongoing FBI operation. Somehow, due to a clerical error, it had ended up parked in her driveway instead of its intended location. Sarah listened intently, her initial shock giving way to disbelief. How could the FBI, a federal agency, make such a mistake? And why hadn't anyone contacted her beforehand? As Agent Harris continued speaking, pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. But even as clarity dawned, new questions emerged. Why had the HOA flagged the car in the first place? And what exactly was the FBI doing in her sleepy suburban neighborhood? For now, Sarah focused on absorbing the information. One thing was certain: this was no ordinary day. What started as a minor inconvenience had spiraled into something far bigger and stranger than she ever could have anticipated. The next morning, Sarah found herself sitting at the long wooden table in the HOA's community center, surrounded by a group of stern-faced board members. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioner and the occasional shuffle of papers. She had spent the entire night preparing for this meeting, determined to clear her name once and for all. Armed with the documentation Agent Harris had provided, a letter on official FBI letterhead, photos of the sedan, and even a signed affidavit, she felt ready to face whatever accusations might come her way. But as she glanced around the table, doubt began to creep in. The HOA board wasn't exactly known for its open-mindedness or flexibility. These were people who took pride in enforcing rules so rigid that even flower pots on porches had to meet specific size requirements. Would they believe her story? Or would they dismiss it as an elaborate excuse to avoid paying the fine? The meeting began with Mrs. Peterson, the HOA president, clearing her throat loudly to get everyone's attention. A no-nonsense woman in her late 60s with perfectly coiffed hair and a clipboard perpetually clutched in her hands, she wasted no time getting down to business. "Miss Thompson," she said, her tone clipped and formal, "we've gathered here today to discuss your recent violation regarding the unauthorized wrapping of a vehicle parked in your driveway." Sarah nodded, taking a deep breath before responding. "I understand why you're concerned," she began, keeping her voice steady despite the nerves bubbling inside her. But I want to assure you that I had absolutely nothing to do with the car wrap, or the car itself, for that matter." Mrs. Peterson raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Then perhaps you can explain why a vehicle bearing your asterisk license plate was parked in your driveway, wrapped in what appears to be promotional branding." Before Sarah could answer, Mr. Dawson, another board member, chimed in. "It looks suspicious if you ask me," he said, leaning back in his chair with a smug expression. "If it's not your car, then where is yours? And why didn't you report this sooner?" Sarah clenched her fists under the table, resisting the urge to snap back. Instead, she calmly pulled out the documents Agent Harris had given her and slid them across the table toward Mrs. Peterson. "This isn't my car," she explained. "It belongs to the FBI. Somehow, due to a clerical error, it ended up in my driveway. I didn't find out about it until after I received your letter." The room fell silent as Mrs. Peterson scanned the documents, her brow furrowing deeper with each passing second. Finally, she looked up, her expression unreadable. "You expect us to believe that the FBI accidentally delivered one of their vehicles to your house?" she asked, her tone dripping with disbelief. Sarah nodded firmly. "Yes, ma'am, I do. It sounds unbelievable, I know, but it's the truth. Agent Harris, the man who came to my house, confirmed everything. He offered to attend this meeting himself to verify my story, but I thought these documents would be enough." Mr. Dawson snorted, shaking his head. "Sounds like a convenient story to me. How do we even know those papers are real? For all we know, you could have forged them yourself." Sarah's cheeks flushed with anger, but she forced herself to stay composed. "If you'd like, I can arrange for Agent Harris to speak with you directly," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "He assured me he'd cooperate fully to resolve this misunderstanding." Mrs. Peterson exchanged glances with the other board members, clearly torn. On one hand, they'd prided themselves on enforcing the rules strictly. On the other, accusing someone of lying about federal involvement seemed risky, even for them. After a few moments of tense silence, she finally spoke. "Very well," she said, adjusting her glasses. "We'll consider your explanation and review the evidence further. However, until we hear directly from this Agent Harris, the fine will remain in place." Sarah sighed, realizing this was the best outcome she could hope for, at least for now. As the meeting adjourned and the board members filed out of the room, she couldn't help but feel frustrated. Though she'd done nothing wrong, proving her innocence was turning out to be far more complicated than she'd anticipated. Still, she resolved to see this through. If the HOA wanted proof, she'd give it to them, even if it meant dragging a federal agent into a dispute over neighborhood aesthetics. The days following the HOA meeting felt like a blur for Sarah. She had done everything she could to present her case, but the board's stubborn refusal to fully accept her explanation left her feeling both defeated and increasingly irritated. The fine still hung over her head, a constant reminder of how absurd the situation had become. If the HOA wasn't going to budge without further proof, then so be it. She would bring them the most undeniable evidence possible. That meant ensuring Agent Harris attended the next meeting in person. When Sarah called him to request his presence, Agent Harris sounded almost amused by the situation. "You're really determined to clear your name, aren't you?" he said, his tone light but respectful. "Don't worry, Miss Thompson. I'll make sure the board understands this was all our mistake." True to his word, Agent Harris arrived at the community center for the follow-up meeting dressed in his usual polished suit, looking every bit the part of a government official. His mere presence commanded attention as he walked into the room, drawing curious stares from the HOA members who were already seated around the table. Mrs. Peterson's eyes widened slightly when she saw him, and even Mr. Dawson seemed less smug than before. "Thank you for coming, Agent Harris," Mrs. Peterson said stiffly, gesturing for him to take a seat. Her voice carried a hint of unease, as though she hadn't expected someone with actual authority to show up and challenge their judgment. Agent Harris nodded politely, pulling out his badge once again for good measure. "Of course, I'm happy to assist in resolving this matter," he said, his tone professional but warm. "Miss Thompson has been cooperative throughout this entire ordeal, despite the inconvenience caused by our error." Mrs. Peterson cleared her throat, clearly uncomfortable under his steady gaze. "We appreciate your cooperation, Agent Harris, but we need to ensure that this misunderstanding doesn't set a precedent. Our guidelines exist for a reason, and exceptions can't be made lightly." Agent Harris leaned forward slightly, his expression serious. "I completely understand the importance of maintaining order within a community like yours," he replied. "However, I must emphasize that Ms. Thompson played no role in the appearance of the vehicle in question. It is an FBI surveillance car, and its presence in her driveway was due to an internal administrative oversight, not any action on her part." He went on to explain in detail how the mix-up had occurred, using terms that were technical enough to sound credible but simple enough for everyone to follow. He described the process of assigning temporary holding locations for undercover vehicles and admitted that human error had led to Sarah's address being flagged incorrectly. By the time he finished speaking, even Mr. Dawson looked less skeptical and more embarrassed for doubting Sarah's story. To drive the point home, Agent Harris handed over additional documentation, including a formal letter from the FBI apologizing for the incident and confirming that the sedan had since been relocated. "We've already taken steps to ensure something like this doesn't happen again," he added, glancing around the table. "And we deeply regret any trouble this may have caused Ms. Thompson or the HOA." For a moment, there was silence as the board members processed everything they'd heard. Finally, Mrs. Peterson sighed heavily, adjusting her glasses once more. "Well," she began, her tone softer now, "given the circumstances and the confirmation provided by Agent Harris, we see no reason to uphold the fine against Miss Thompson." Relief washed over Sarah as the word sank in. She had finally won, not just the fight to clear her name, but also the validation that she had done nothing wrong. The board unanimously agreed to resign the fine and issue a formal apology, though Sarah suspected it wouldn't stop them from scrutinizing her lawn maintenance habits anytime soon. As the meeting concluded, Agent Harris shook hands with the board members before turning to Sarah. "I hope this puts an end to the chaos," he said with a small smile. "You handled this remarkably well, considering the circumstances." Sarah laughed nervously, still processing everything that had happened. "Thanks for stepping in," she said. "Honestly, I never thought I'd have to deal with something like this just because of where I live." Agent Harris chuckled. "Life has a way of surprising us," he replied. With that, he gave her a polite nod and left, leaving Sarah alone in the now empty room. Though the ordeal was finally over, she couldn't help but marvel at how surreal it all had been. From mysterious cars to federal agents, her quiet suburban life had taken a detour into the extraordinary, and she wasn't quite sure whether to laugh or cry about it. With the HOA's decision to resign the fine and issue a formal apology, Sarah thought the chaos surrounding the FBI sedan would finally come to an end. But life in her tightly regulated neighborhood wasn't about to let her off that easily. The fallout from the incident lingered like a storm cloud, casting long shadows over what should have been a triumphant resolution. Word of the bizarre mix-up spread quickly through the community, thanks in part to Mrs. Peterson's inability to keep anything private. Within hours, whispers filled the streets. "Did you hear? Sarah Thompson had an FBI car parked in her driveway." Some neighbors were amused, others skeptical, and a few seemed outright jealous. After all, how many people could claim they'd unknowingly hosted a federal surveillance vehicle? At first, Sarah tried to ignore the gossip. She went about her routine, watering her plants, checking her mailbox, and avoiding eye contact with anyone who looked like they might want to ask questions. But it wasn't long before curiosity got the better of her neighbors. One afternoon, as she was trimming her hedges, Mrs. Langley from across the street approached her with a plate of cookies and a gleam of intrigue in her eyes. "I just wanted to say how brave you were, standing up to the HOA like that," Mrs. Langley said, handing over the plate. And to think, an FBI car. What on earth were they doing here? Sarah forced a smile, unsure whether to laugh or cringe. Honestly, I don't know much more than you do, she admitted. They told me it was some kind of clerical error. Apparently, my address got flagged by mistake. Mrs. Langley nodded knowingly, though Sarah suspected she didn't fully believe her. Well, whatever it was, it certainly shook things up around here. You've become quite the talk of the town. While some neighbors treated her like a local celebrity, others weren't so kind. Mr. Dawson, still smarting from being proven wrong, muttered under his breath whenever he saw her. Mark my words, he told anyone who would listen. This is why we need stricter rules. People can't just bring government vehicles into our community without consequences. His grumbling only fueled more rumors, which ranged from wild theories about Sarah secretly working for the FBI to accusations that she had staged the whole thing for attention. Though most of these claims were baseless, they weighed heavily on her. For someone who valued peace and quiet, the sudden spotlight felt suffocating. To make matters worse, the HOA announced plans to implement new guidelines aimed at preventing similar incidents in the future. At their next meeting, Mrs. Peterson unveiled a proposal requiring residents to report any unfamiliar vehicles parked in their driveways within 24 hours. This will ensure that our neighborhood remains safe and compliant, she declared, though Sarah couldn't help but feel the rule was directed squarely at her. Despite the lingering drama, there was a silver lining. Agent Harris followed up with Sarah shortly after the meeting, offering a small stipend as compensation for the inconvenience caused by the FBI's error. Think of it as a token of gratitude for your patience, he explained during their brief phone call. While the money wasn't much, it was enough to cover a weekend getaway, a welcome escape from the prying eyes and idle chatter of her neighbors. As Sarah packed her bags for the trip, she reflected on everything that had happened. What started as a simple misunderstanding had spiraled into a whirlwind of bureaucracy, suspicion, and absurdity. Yet, through it all, she had managed to maintain her composure and fight for the truth. It wasn't easy, but she emerged stronger and perhaps a little wiser for it. Still, as she pulled out of her driveway, she couldn't resist glancing back one last time. Her neighborhood looked peaceful under the golden afternoon sun, its manicured lawns and neatly painted houses exuding an air of perfection. But beneath the surface, Sarah knew better. Behind every closed door lay secrets, assumptions, and untold stories waiting to unfold. And while she hoped nothing like this would ever happen again, deep down, she suspected her days of unexpected surprises were far from over. When Sarah returned from her weekend getaway, she found her neighborhood just as she had left it. Quiet, orderly, and seemingly untouched by the chaos that had unfolded. The lawns were still pristine, the sidewalks empty save for the occasional jogger or dog walker, and the air carried the faint scent of freshly cut grass. On the surface, life appeared to have returned to normal. But Sarah knew better. Beneath the calm exterior, the ripple effects of the FBI car incident lingered, shaping how people viewed her and how she saw herself. The gossip had died down somewhat, though not entirely. Neighbors who once barely acknowledged her now waved enthusiastically when they passed her on the street. Some even stopped to chat, peppering her with questions about the FBI situation. Did she know any agents personally? Had she seen anything exciting while the car was parked in her driveway? Sarah answered politely, but kept her responses vague, unwilling to fuel further speculation. She didn't want to become the neighborhood's go-to source for conspiracy theories or tall tales. Still, there were moments when she couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. One evening, while watering her front yard, she overheard two teenagers whispering conspiratorially near the corner. "That's the lady with the spy car," one of them said, pointing in her direction. Sarah turned away to hide her grin, pretending not to notice. If nothing else, the incident had given her a newfound appreciation for humor and patience. Despite the lingering attention, Sarah felt a sense of relief knowing the ordeal was truly behind her. The HOA fine had been rescinded, Agent Harris had assured her the sit-in wouldn't reappear, and life seemed to be settling into its usual rhythm. Yet the experience had changed her in ways she hadn't anticipated. For years, she had prided herself on following rules and avoiding conflict, believing that staying under the radar was the key to happiness. Now, however, she realized that sometimes standing up for yourself, even against impossible odds, was worth the effort. Her perspective on the HOA also shifted. While she still respected their commitment to maintaining order, she no longer feared them as much as she once did. Their rigid adherence to rules suddenly seemed less intimidating and more human. After all, they were just people trying to keep things running smoothly, even if their methods were occasionally ridiculous. Sarah resolved to approach future interactions with them, not as an adversary, but as someone willing to find common ground. As weeks turned into months, the memory of the FBI car became more of a funny story than a source of stress. At dinner parties or casual gatherings, friends would ask her to recount the tale, and she obliged, adding dramatic pauses and playful embellishments for effect. And then, she'd say with a wink, "I discovered my quiet little neighborhood was actually a secret government hotspot." But perhaps the biggest change was within Sarah herself. The incident taught her that life rarely followed a predictable script, and that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Before, she might have panicked at the thought of breaking HOA rules or attracting unwanted attention. Now, she approached challenges with a mix of determination and levity, knowing she could handle whatever came her way. One crisp autumn morning, as she sipped coffee on her porch, Sarah noticed a new car pulling into a neighbor's driveway. It was sleek, black, and for a fleeting moment, her heart skipped a beat. Then she laughed softly, shaking her head at her own paranoia. Life was full of surprises, and she had learned to embrace them rather than fear them. From then on, whenever she spotted something unusual in her neighborhood, a strange car, a mysterious visitor, or even an overly zealous HOA inspection, she reminded herself of one simple truth: even in the most ordinary places, extraordinary things could happen. And maybe, just maybe, that wasn't such a bad thing after all.